Hello folks, welcome to your first recorded lecture for HI121 in fall 2021. So we're just going to have a bit of a short lecture to start things off with. This is just a quick look at some of the challenges we face in studying the ancient world in a global context. These are challenges that are going to keep cropping up throughout the term, so it's good to sort of establish them at the get-go so that we can keep them in mind. All right, first and foremost, we have a central problem in studying ancient history, period. This is the existence of two major disciplines, both of which have a role in allowing us to understand the distant past. So when I say these are two different disciplines, I mean they are different. There are other disciplines that do play a role, and certainly we're going to be talking about some of them. But the challenge with history and archaeology is that they have different methods, different agendas, different blind spots. It's all well and good to say we must be interdisciplinary, and it's true, we must. But being interdisciplinary is easier said than done. So archaeology, the modern discipline, is often defined as the investigation of material culture, exclusively material culture. So this can cause some problems, obviously, if you're an archaeologist of a period where there are written sources. Should you really cut yourself off from that material when these sources can answer some of the questions that you're asking about the material culture? History, on the other hand, has been around for much longer as a discipline, and early on, it did not exclude looking at material culture. Pre-modern historians in particular often talk about monuments and that sort of thing. Now, they didn't have the sort of systematic methods that scholars of today do, but it's still worth pointing out that it's only very recently that history and archaeology have been divided, and we've had scholars who specialize in one or the other. Now, we cannot argue that archaeologists are the ones who should be dealing with cultures for which there is no documentary evidence. They're the ones with the training and the specialized methods. But what happens when the first texts appear? Do archaeologists immediately stop being interested in that culture? No, of course not. Now, it's important to remember archaeologists are not just doing preparatory work for historians when we're looking at the ancient world. They're not just digging up objects, they are making their own interpretations based on what they find. But the question of where the boundaries are remains. So what questions do archaeologists look at? Which questions should be left to historians? What level of interdisciplinary cooperation is productive or even desirable? It's basically all in the eye of the beholder and what perspective you're taking on all of this. So this course is a history course that will use archaeological material on an extremely regular basis. I am a historian, but I choose to include archaeological evidence in my interpretation of the past, and every lecture that I give you is an interpretation of the past. Now, it is an interpretation that is based on other people's interpretations, so it's several removes in most cases from the original sources. But it's necessary when you're looking at the ancient world to include archaeological evidence because at best, most of the civilizations that we're looking at have a patchy documentary record. Now, we will look at ancient sources, primarily at our Zoom sessions, but they have their own challenges. So for instance, ancient authors have limited interests. So for those who wrote about history, they were concerned primarily with political history. There are sources with wider interests. There are sources that give us different views of ancient societies. So religious texts, legal texts, personal letters, so on and so forth. But we don't always understand the unspoken assumptions or priorities that we see in these texts. So I'm going to give you an example here. This is a story from my graduate student life. When I first started my PhD, I did a reading course with my supervisor, and we were reading late Roman law. And the first thing he did was to say, go get the Theodosian Code out of the library, read it cover to cover. Now, the Theodosian Code is about 600 pages long in translation, great big book, multiple columns, it's really huge. So it took me a couple months to get through it. And we would meet every couple of weeks and I would talk about what I saw in the law with him. So I came across this really strange law. And one of the problems with the Theodosian Code is that these were originally laws that were issued in most cases in response to specific situations. But when they were put into the code, they had all that information stripped out of them, and all you get is the do this or do not do this, or if this happens, this is what you must do. So this law was strange. Basically, all it said was anyone who builds an irrigation canal on the Nile River was to be taken to the site of that canal and burned alive. It was a bit shocking. It seems very draconian. Capital punishment, not just capital punishment, but a really horrific type of capital punishment just for building an irrigation canal. So I went in to see my supervisor and I said, so what's up with this? And he said, well, let's sit down and figure it out together. So what we had to do was to think about the context. So I don't know how many of you know much about the Nile River, but one of the things the Nile does is it floods. And it floods in an extremely regular way. The floods were predictable. The floods were the only reason that Egypt was able to develop intensive agriculture in the first place. So, if you start digging irrigation canals, you might mess with the predictability of the floods. If you mess with the predictability of the floods, you might damage the agricultural capacity of the area. All right, so there's one thing that we discerned from this law, but that still doesn't explain, why are you burning people alive for doing this? So I remember my supervisor, who was an interesting kind of guy. He sort of looked like Santa Claus. He sort of grinned and leaned back in his chair, and he said, I had you doing some reading about Roman Egypt. What can you tell me about its economy? And I thought a bit, and I said, Roman Egypt was the breadbasket of the empire. And that's not just a throwaway comment, by the way. So one of the things you need to know about the later Roman Empire is that the cities were very, very large. There's even some evidence that Constantinople may have had 500,000 people in the 5th century. This is very big, and other cities may have been similar. It's very big by pre-industrial standards, where you're living in an agricultural subsistence level economy. How do you support unproductive populations of that size? Well, you support it by a very, very rigid and carefully organized system of urban provisioning, which, by the way, is also in the Theodosian Code. So what they would do is they would ship grain from various parts of the empire that produced it, most especially Egypt. They would ship them to the cities. There were whole systems of bakeries where bread would be made and then handed out. It's called the annona. So I said, fine, it's because Egypt is such an agricultural power. It would mess with urban provisioning. And he smiled, my supervisor, and said, so if it messes with urban provisioning, what happens? And I remember I sat there and I finally said, food riots. And then he grinned at me again and said, and what happens when you have food riots in an imperial capital? Well, what happens is that the welfare of the emperor can be threatened. And if you threaten the welfare of the emperor, you are committing treason. So basically, the explanation for the law is that you were burned alive at the site of your irrigation canal because messing with the irrigation in Egypt could potentially be an act of treason. You see how important the context was for that? And that was actually a fairly simple one to unravel. It still took us 20 minutes to talk about it at the time. There are many more laws in the Theodosian Code that are a lot more obscure than that, where we just look at them and we think, oh, why is it like this? What does this mean? And we just don't have the information. Now, the outlook of sources like this can be very narrow. They can reflect the priorities and the ideals of a specific class or a subset of a class. So while it does give us a snapshot of their thinking, we don't always understand it. Now we also have the question of source survival. We have only a fraction of what was actually written. It's often determined by chance or by what later scholars thought was worthy of copying. There are so many really important manuscripts where we have only one copy of it. How many were lost completely? Now, surviving documents can also be fragmentary. People who work on Egypt often find themselves needing to study papyrus fragments. And these papyrus fragments give us bits and pieces of information about the government of Roman Egypt. But how do you fill in the holes? How much should you fill in the holes if it's all educated guesswork? Now, because of the many challenges of studying the ancient period, we've seen the emergence of what you might call subdisciplines. So these are highly specialized approaches to specific types of evidence. So the study of papyrus documents is called papyrology. And in the past, this has been a very technical field. Scholars who study it focus on reading, translating, and commenting on papyrology. And it's only fairly recently that papyrologists started to use this material to answer questions about social and economic history. It's still a bit stunted when it comes to the development of methodology. It's a very traditional discipline. And I think the best way to explain why is because it requires an incredible level of skill with ancient languages, which are not easy to learn. So it's going to take more time for a discipline like that to change. Now, inscriptions can also be an important source. They are written but not documents, you might say. And the field of study that covers this material is called epigraphy. Epigraphy often gets a bad rap, in the 19th century especially, since so many inscriptions are actually epitaphs, so on tombstones. People who studied them were seen as morbid, and a lot of people brushed off the importance of what epigraphy could tell us. But think for a minute about how many different forms inscriptions can take. Is a Roman epitaph the same thing as Greek graffiti carved into the side of a building? What about inscriptions on coins or engravings on gems? You have clay tablets and seals from Sumerian cities. You have oracle bones from ancient China. These are all inscriptions, as in the thing they say is actually inscribed upon the object. They can say completely different things and be written for totally different reasons. Now, because of these subfields, there are several more I won't talk about, leads to a certain degree of fragmentation in the literature on the ancient world. And this is a specific challenge for people who study the ancient world in a global context. Because if you have all of these tiny subdisciplines all looking at the ancient world from their own perspective, it can be hard to sort of take a step back and see it on the global level. And that brings us to the major problem, of course, the language issue. No one person can be a specialist in all the languages, all the methods that you need for a more holistic, global look at the ancient world, or very few people can, at least. To give you an example, when I was considering what I wanted to do in my PhD studies, I asked a favorite professor of mine who had taught me an MA course, and I said, what would it take for me to be able to do Byzantine history? And he just looked at me and said, first of all, you'd have to take 5 years off and study languages. And I immediately went, what, really? Really? He said, you don't have Greek. You don't have the type of Greek that you'd need either. So there's Greek. And then he started to list off all of the other languages I would need to study the particular area of Byzantine history that he and I had studied together. And he got to 12 languages, and I said, stop. I understand the problem. So while I still do teach Byzantine history, I teach it as a sort of teaching interest. I don't specialize in it because I can't read the vast majority of the literature that's written about it or the primary sources. I can, however, include it in my medieval courses, and I do as much as I can because it is fascinating stuff. So, periodization. This is basically, how do we divide history into parts? And this has serious repercussions for our ability to take a global perspective as well. Where do we start? Well, what I want to do is to give you a very basic timeline for prehistory, just to point out how messy and borderline inappropriate it is. So in the late 19th century, a Danish scholar came up with the three-age system. So this is stone, bronze, and iron. And he did this after he observed that artifacts made of these different materials were found at different levels in sites that he was investigating. So the stone tools were the deepest, then the bronze, then the iron. The Stone Age is subdivided. So you have the Paleolithic, the Old Stone Age, which is the beginning of direct human ancestry. It's considered to be pre-10,000 BCE. Now the Mesolithic, so the Middle Stone Age, is where you see hunter-gatherers. It begins basically at the end of the last ice age, but when does it end? It ends with farming. At least that's the traditional idea. But farming begins at different times in different places. So in Southeast Europe, farming begins in around 7,000 BCE. In Central Europe, around 5,500. Northern Europe, about 4,000 BCE. But in the Near East, it's more like 9,000 BCE. So I think you're probably starting to see the problem with this. Now the Neolithic, the New Stone Age, the era of farming, is usually seen to end with bronze working, which is also introduced in different places at different times. So 2,900 or thereabouts in Uruk, 3,000 in the Aegean, 1,800 in Central Europe. And if you look outside Europe, the system starts to develop even more flaws. In sub-Saharan Africa, they go right from stone to iron. In other areas, you have a Chalcolithic or Copper Age, a transition period where cultures haven't yet found out what happens when you add tin to copper. And this is possible because, of course, tin is harder to find than copper is. Australia and the Pacific only had Stone Ages. The Europeans brought metals. The Americas have their own separate classification system. The Iron Age is considered to begin in different places at different times as well. And people say, oh, well, it ends with the rise of the written historical tradition. But we're going to see in a minute why that's a problem. So this is a categorization system based on technology. So of course it's not going to be in sync across the globe. And of course it is very Eurocentric. So it's of limited usefulness. But it's not going anywhere. Like, we may as well try to make the sun rise in the West as get rid of the idea of the Stone Age and the Bronze Age and the Iron Age. It is too deeply entrenched in historical thinking. So we have to acknowledge it for the influence that it's had on scholarly thought, but we also have to acknowledge that it's oversimplified. So when does prehistory end? Again, it is generally connected to the beginning of writing, but that happens at such different times. In Britain, for example, you can argue that prehistory ends at 55 BCE. Why? Because Julius Caesar landed and wrote a history of the island, or a history of his conquest, as he called it, of the island. Whereas in Mesopotamia, we look at dates in the Neolithic for the birth of writing. So can we say this particular system of classification is even useful? Should we privilege writing the way we do? If you privilege writing, you overlook the fact that some civilizations simply did not. Take the Inca. So they were a largely oral society. They used something called the quipu, which is a system of knotted strings, which vanished, by the way, after the Spanish invasion. It's hard to say what these were exactly. There are a number of theories. They're likely not a recording system. The best theory I've seen is that they were memory aids. So basically mnemonics to trigger recall. And people in an oral civilization often will have incredible memories because their memories are trained. They are taught how to retain information in a way that people in a written society that uses written texts are not. So does this mean that the Inca are halfway between history and prehistory? It's a strange sort of thing to say. Like, how do you actually account for that? We got to think about it this way. When we think of illiteracy, socially speaking, there are negative connotations to that in our world today. But this isn't necessarily applicable to ancient societies. Illiterate does not mean primitive. And we don't have any access to the oral tradition, which is really a shame. So again, there's a severe problem with this classification system, but people have still kept it because you need something to serve as a starting point. So maybe you have a basic timeline, or at least a flexible timeline. How do you determine dates? Now, there are two different types of dating, relative and absolute. Relative dating is probably simpler because it simply puts an occurrence earlier or later than another. It's established through a couple of means. Seriation, which is the arrangement of archaeological artifacts in a sequence of assumed date of manufacture. Obviously, this is highly open to interpretation. And also stratigraphy. So archaeological strata are basically the layers of occupation. The ground level rises as new buildings are built on top of the ruins of old buildings. Strata are not always easy to identify. Maybe a city is rebuilt in part and not in others. So the layers can be combined. That image, by the way, is an image of archaeological strata on display in the Athens metro system. Now, remember, archaeologists interpret their evidence just as much as historians interpret theirs. Just because you dig up something concrete doesn't make your interpretation of the absolute unvarnished truth. All interpretations, whether they're of material or documentary evidence, are filtered through one's own perspective and preconceptions. Now, the other form of dating, of course, is absolute dating. And this assigns a specific calendar date. This is often calculated by scientific means. So things like radiocarbon dating or dendrochronology. Dendrochronology is the use of tree rings to determine the date. It's not foolproof because there is a margin of error in the dating, plus samples can be contaminated. I mean, what happens if beams from a 500-year-old tree are used in a new house? How do you date the house? Using the wood. You don't, not successfully at least. Absolute dating can also be done using written documentation, especially those that record astronomical events. This is how our traditional chronology of the ancient world was first constructed. Now, the problem with ancient reports of eclipses or planetary sightings, you always have to ask yourself, are they accurate? You also have to remember that people writing pre-modern history may actually be trying to add drama to the stories they're telling. So they throw in some astronomical phenomenon in a way to just spice up the story a little bit. Now, documents are tricky in other ways as well. One of the more common types of early document is a king list. It's a list of rulers of a given society. King lists can't always be trusted. They are some of our earliest documents, but they can include both actual historical figures and mythological figures. Now, it becomes a little bit easier in the first millennium CE, once we start correlating things with the Gregorian calendar to tell when somebody is holding on to something that they shouldn't be. All right. So let's close this out with just a little bit of discussion of what we should remember going forward. The first thing, terminology and periodization is in flux. It's constantly debated. It is safe to say, and I say this hoping that you will hear me and remember this, there is no one-size-fits-all scheme that neatly categorizes all ancient history. So the messiness, the blurred lines are there whether we like it or not. Secondly, an interdisciplinary perspective is essential, but the disciplines as they stand right now don't always cooperate well with one another. Not because they don't want to, but because it's hard to find a balance between very different methods and approaches, and the demanding nature of some of the subfields that you have to master just make things more difficult. Now, finally, studying the ancient world in a global context adds even more complications. Our old Eurocentric schemes of organizing history do not fit the rest of the world. The old ways of looking at ancient history focus on civilizations as discrete units, as if they're self contained, which of course they are not. It couldn't be further from the truth. Global history, even in the ancient period, has to be about looking at connections, about taking different perspectives. So that's why we're going to try and do that this term. So that is our lecture for our very first topic. I will be returning shortly with a lecture on Uruk, and I hope you have been given some food for thought here. I look forward to providing you more snapshots of the ancient world as the term goes on. Thanks very much, guys.